The first image I pulled off that SD card was a cow elk at 2:14 in the morning, exactly what I'd placed the camera there to document. The second was a red fox crossing the same game trail about 40 minutes later. I loaded 63 images in total, covering dates from November 17th through November 22nd of 2019, and when I reached frame 43, my hand went still on the mouse. It is a black and white infrared still, time-stamped 4:12 in the afternoon on a Wednesday in November, and in the lower left corner of that frame there is a small shape in the snow that I recognized immediately as a child. Behind that child, positioned between him and the northwest wind, curved around him the way a stone wall curves around what it is sheltering, is the reason Owen Kowalski is alive today. If you're not subscribed yet, take a second and do that now. We put out a new story every week, and I don't want you to miss them. My name is Paul Garrett. I was 47 years old in the fall of 2019, and I had been a wildlife biologist with the Hungry Horse Glacier View Ranger District of the Flathead National Forest for 15 years. I grew up in Columbia Falls, which is a small city of about 5,000 people at the entrance to Glacier National Park on the western Montana side of the Continental Divide. Columbia Falls sits at the confluence of the North Fork and Middle Fork of the Flathead River, about 9 miles west of the park's West Glacier entrance, and about 40 miles southeast of Polebridge, the last inhabited community before the North Fork Road becomes too rough for most vehicles. It is the kind of town where most families are connected to the forest in some direct form, through logging or outfitting or Forest Service employment or the general service economy that exists because people come from outside to see mountains and rivers that still operate mostly on their own terms. Growing up there gives you a specific kind of geographic grounding, an orientation toward landscape that becomes structural rather than aesthetic. You don't see the mountains as scenery, you see them as weather and direction and seasonal rhythm. My father worked 31 years for the USFS on the Trails crew out of the Hungry Horse Ranger District office, which sits about 9 miles east of Columbia Falls on the South Fork Road. He was not an intellectual man about the forest. He read no scientific literature, held no theories about ecology, and would have been impatient with most of what I do for a living. But he knew the North Fork drainage the way a very good carpenter knows a specific building, which roads would go to mud in the spring thaw, and for how long, which drainages would flood in a heavy snowmelt year and wash out the access culverts before equipment could get in, where the old-growth western larch still stood on the west-facing benches from before the logging era, and where the lodgepole second growth had come back so thick you needed a saw to make forward progress. He knew it as physical terrain, in his body rather than in his head. And that knowledge transferred to me the way physical knowledge always transfers between people who spend a lot of time in the same place together, through observation, through repetition, through the gradual accumulation of things noticed and not forgotten. I went to the University of Montana for wildlife biology, starting in the fall of 1992. Missoula is a university town on the Clark Fork River, about 2 hours south of Columbia Falls, in a valley that has its own character, more populated, more agricultural in the adjacent country, the mountains visible but at a remove that makes them background rather than environment. UM's wildlife biology program was rigorous about fieldwork, which is why I chose it. The professors running it in the 90s were active researchers, most of them with ongoing field programs in the region, and the coursework required sustained time in the field, rather than treating fieldwork as an occasional supplement to classroom instruction. I did elk population surveys in the Bitterroot Valley in my junior year, bird census work in the Blackfoot River watershed, and an independent study on pine marten distribution in the Swan Range that required 4 months of snowshoe transects in January and February when the temperature in the Swan drainage could drop to 35 below and stay there, for days at a time. The formal science taught me to think systematically about the questions I'd been asking informally since I was a kid. Population dynamics, habitat analysis, and the factors that shape habitat suitability for different species. The statistical methods you need to extract reliable signal from the noisy, incomplete data that field research always produces. The distinction between what an observation actually shows and what you wish it showed, which is not as obvious as it sounds when you're in the field with strong expectations. By my senior year, I knew I wanted to work in the Northern Rockies, specifically in the large mammal monitoring work that required the combination of terrain knowledge and analytical discipline that had been developing in me, and I knew I wanted to work with wolverines. After graduating in '96, I spent 2 years doing wolverine research for a foundation based in Boise, Idaho, in the Selway Bitterroot and Frank Church wilderness areas. Those 2 years built the methodological foundation for the Flathead work and kept pointing me toward the North Fork drainage specifically, which appeared consistently in the scientific literature as one of the most reliably documented wolverine areas in the lower 48. The GS-11 biologist position with the Hungry Horse District opened in the fall of 2003, and I applied before the posting had been up 48 hours. I'd been back in Columbia Falls for a year at that point, doing contract work for an environmental consulting firm in Missoula, waiting for the right position to open in the right place. The Hungry Horse job was exactly what I'd been positioning myself for. Wolverine monitoring in the North Fork, in the drainage I'd grown up beside, in the forest my father had worked his entire career. I started in January of 2004, and have been in this district every year since. The North Fork of the Flathead River drains the western slope of the Continental Divide from the Canadian border south to the Middle Fork confluence above Columbia Falls, cutting through what is now Glacier National Park on the eastern bank and several 100,000 acres of Flathead National Forest on the western slope. The outside North Fork Road, maintained by Flathead County as gravel and unpaved dirt, runs about 60 miles from the Blankenship Bridge at the south end of the drainage north to the border area near Kintla Lake. Polebridge is the last inhabited settlement of real consequence before the road becomes rough enough to deter most vehicles. About 35 residents year-round, no municipal power grid, propane and generators, and firewood. The Polebridge Mercantile has been in operation since 1914, and the Northern Lights Saloon next to it operates on a schedule calibrated to its community.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
Beyond Polebridge, the North Fork Road continues as a rough two-track for another 25 or 30 miles before reaching the border drainage, and in November that northern section is impassable to standard vehicles and is not maintained by the county at all. The Forest Service closes the lower access gates in November. Along the 60 miles of that road, the forest changes character repeatedly based on aspect, elevation, drainage, and fire history. Open lodgepole stands on the drier south-facing aspects that burned repeatedly in the 19th century, the even-age stands that fire creates when it moves through quickly. Dense mixed conifer in the creek bottoms and on north-facing slopes where moisture accumulates year-round, Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir in the lower sections, transitioning to whitebark pine on the higher ridges, narrow river-bottom meadows thick with alder, willow, and mountain ash along the North Fork itself, the shrubby vegetation that grows where the river changes its channel and the soil is periodically renewed by flood. Remnant old-growth western larch on the gentler west-facing benches where the fire return interval was long enough for trees to reach their full dimension before the next fire, larch, that were young trees when Lewis and Clark were traveling through the drainage. In summer, the North Fork is humid and green, the creeks cold and clear, the North Fork River a wide braided channel over gravel bars where mergansers work the shallows and moose wade at dawn. By November, the North Fork is a different place. The silence is a different silence, not the absence of summer activity, but a presence in a different register, the forest doing its cold season work at a frequency that isn't audible in the same way the summer's is. The river runs dark and cold under a narrow band of open sky between ridgelines. The snowpack settles into its shape for the winter, in a good snow year, 3 to 4 feet on the benches by mid-November, deeper in the creek bottoms and on the north-facing slopes. The animals that remain in the drainage after the ungulate migration to lower elevation, the wolves, the mountain lions, the wolverines, the ravens and chickadees, and nuthatches and dippers working the creek margins, move through that November silence, doing what they have always done in November in this drainage, everything necessary to survive and no more. The wildlife in the North Fork is extraordinary by any measure. Gray wolves in multiple packs, grizzly bears through autumn before denning, mountain lions on the rocky benches, moose in the wet creek drainages, elk on the south-facing slopes, in numbers that sustain a hunting season. It is one of the most complete large mammal ecosystems in the lower 48, and 15 years of fieldwork in it has given me the specific knowledge of a place that only comes from sustained presence. My primary assignment since 2016 was the Wolverine Monitoring Program, a collaborative initiative between the Flathead National Forest and Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks established in advance of a federal listing review for the species. The North Fork drainage has one of the more reliably documented wolverine populations in the lower 48 states, partly because of the deep, persistent snowpack wolverines require for denning, and partly because the low human activity in the interior drainages keeps disturbance pressure at a level the species can tolerate. The monitoring involved 14 Reconyx Hyperfire, 2 cameras placed along natural travel corridors in the Coal Creek, Whale Creek, and Trail Creek drainages, the professional standard for remote wildlife monitoring, with fast trigger response, no glow infrared illumination that doesn't alarm animals, reliable battery performance in cold conditions, and polycarbonate housings designed for extended field deployment in mountain winters. I checked the array every 4 to 6 weeks, pulling cards and replacing lures and logging every image into the shared database. In 3 field seasons, the array had documented 4 confirmed wolverines, each individually identified from their chest patches and entered into the regional database, along with a bull elk, 12 white-tailed deer, 2 black bears, 1 grizzly, and 1 mountain lion. Camera 12 was at the mouth of Coal Creek, where the drainage opened onto a natural bench on the western slope, 1.4 miles from the North Fork Road by the most direct approach. The bench is a terrain feature I've valued since my first field season in the North Fork, flat ground and steep country, which is rare enough to be significant. Every large mammal species in the drainage uses it as a travel corridor at some point, because flat ground saves energy for animals that are constantly moving in terrain that demands it, and animals understand this efficiency in their bodies, even if they don't articulate it as a principle. The bench runs about a quarter mile along the western slope, before narrowing and disappearing into the upper Coal Creek drainage, and I had watched it long enough to understand the seasonal patterns of who used it and when. I positioned camera 12 on a lodgepole pine at the south end of the bench in the spring of 2016, at chest height, aimed northeast along the bench with a 60-foot sightline. In addition to the standard motion trigger, it ran time-lapse frames every 4 hours as a backup, capturing the bench regardless of whether something passed close enough to trigger the motion sensor. In 3 field seasons, it had documented the adult male wolverine on 4 separate occasions, the most frequent wolverine documentation in the entire array, along with the bull elk, 12 white-tailed deer, 2 black bears, the grizzly, and the mountain lion. It was my best performing station in terms of large mammal diversity, and I had every intention of maintaining it in its current location through the full wolverine survey period. I had no plan to pull the card from camera 12 until the first week of December. The November card was on the schedule for replacement December 2nd or 3rd, depending on road access and conditions. On November 20th, my actual plan was to be at my desk in Hungry Horse, drafting the first sections of the annual Wolverine Summary Report, the document that pulled together the field season's data for submission to the Montana FWP Regional Office and the USFS District Supervisor. It was not work I was looking forward to. The report was long and the format was fixed, and the data were better than the report would make them look. But it was work that needed doing before the end of the calendar year. On Friday evening, I planned to drive to Kalispell to pick up my wife Liz from the airport. She had been in Portland visiting her sister for 10 days, and I had been eating from cans and sleeping in the middle of the bed and looking forward to Friday considerably more than to the Wolverine report. Owen Kowalski was 6 years old when he walked off the porch of the Brewer cabin on the afternoon of November 20th, 2019, in a northwest wind and 9 degrees Fahrenheit, and disappeared into the timber to the north. His father was Mark Kowalski, 38, a civil engineer from Missoula who had hunted elk in the North Fork since his uncle brought him up for the first time at 17. 20 years of returning to the same drainage at the same season gives a person a specific kind of familiarity with a place. He knew which ridges held elk in the mornings, which drainages the animals retreated to midday, to bed down out of the wind, where the wallows were, and which ones were showing fresh use, which 2-track accesses were passable in what kind of truck. He was comfortable in the North Fork in the way that 2 decades of returning to the same place produces, and that comfort had begun to function as a substitute for the active attention that mountain terrain demands from people who are less familiar with it. Comfort in serious terrain is a form of debt, Eventually, the note comes due. He had rented the Brewer cabin about 6 miles north of Polebridge, a 2-room frame structure with a wood stove, propane range, and no running water after October. On the kitchen wall was a hand-drawn terrain sketch annotated with years of the Brewer family's elk observations, the accumulated field intelligence of a family that had worked the same piece of country for decades. Mark had scouted Monday the 18th, found fresh elk sign on the north bench, 2 miles from the cabin, and returned with Julie and Owen on Tuesday the 19th, planning to hunt Wednesday and Thursday before driving home Friday. Julie would keep Owen at the cabin during the hunting windows. Owen had been excited about the mountains for weeks. This was his first trip into the North Fork, and Mark had promised him a day hike to a beaver pond if the weather cooperated. The plan made sense in the context of what a typical November week in the North Fork looked like. The drainage gets snow in November and temperatures drop, sometimes substantially. But the cabin was built for those conditions. It had survived many winters, worse than anything a Tuesday to Friday hunting trip was likely to produce. What the plan did not account for was the system that the National Weather Service in Missoula had been watching since Monday the 18th. A low-pressure cell forming over the Gulf of Alaska that was moving southeast faster than usual, and a dome of Arctic air over the Alberta plains that was pushing south and west ahead of it, which the models were consistently underestimating. The front arrived Wednesday afternoon. What the Missoula NWS had called for at the valley level was 6 to 8 inches of new snow and a temperature drop to around 0 by Thursday morning, the kind of forecast that changes hunting conditions but doesn't change the fundamental calculus of a cabin trip. The Brewer cabin had a good stove and enough wood and walls built for this. What actually happened was that the Arctic air mass from Alberta moved faster than the updated model runs resolved, flowing south ahead of the low-pressure system and flooding the North Fork Valley from the Canadian border with cold air that dropped the temperature at the cabin 15 degrees faster than anyone had predicted. By 2:30 Wednesday afternoon, the sky above the cabin had turned the specific flat pewter color that experienced people in this drainage recognize as indicating a change of category rather than a change of intensity. By 3 o'clock, the snow was coming in sideways on a 25-mile-per-hour northwest wind, and the temperature had already dropped to 9 degrees Fahrenheit and was falling. Owen had been on the covered porch in his red down jacket and snow pants and rubber-soled winter boots. The porch faced the road and was sheltered from the northwest by the cabin's main body, so, in that specific spot, the snow fell mostly straight down, and the wind was reduced to an occasional gust, rather than the sustained flow that was hitting the exposed south and west faces of the building. Owen was doing what 6-year-olds do with new heavy snow, testing its weight, watching it accumulate on the porch railing, moving it around with his boots, pressing it into shapes, conducting the small, private experiments that children undertake with every new material they encounter. He was occupied and sheltered and warm enough in the jacket and snow pants, which were rated for conditions colder than 9 degrees. Mark went to the woodpile at 3:45 for more fuel for the stove. The pile was 30 paces from the porch, around the corner of the building on the south side, and his first armload slipped when he got back to the door, and he had to make a second trip. Under 5 minutes total, probably closer to 4. When he came back through the porch door with the second armload, Owen was not there. The boot tracks went off the south end of the porch, across the yard, and then turned north toward the timber. They were already softening under the accumulation, the edges of Owen's boot prints losing definition, the interiors filling with horizontally driven snow. The tracks led into the lodgepole stand behind the cabin and disappeared about 30 yards in, where the tree roots and the irregular ground broke up the surface until even fresh tracks were hard to follow. Mark called Owen's name. The timber absorbed the sound. He went in after Owen on foot, expanding in an arc from the point where the tracks disappeared, calling repeatedly. He searched for 45 minutes before the failing light and the building storm convinced him he needed more help than he had. He drove the 6 miles south to Polebridge. No cell service on the North Fork Road north of Polebridge. The terrain and distance from any tower make coverage effectively non-existent. The Polebridge Mercantile had a public phone. Mark reached the Flathead County Sheriff's Office at 5:38 in the afternoon and reported a missing child, 6 years old, last seen on the porch of the Brewer cabin at 3:45 p.m., wearing a red down jacket, snow pants, and rubber-soled winter boots, heading north into the timber. Karen Webb, My supervisor at the Hungry Horse District office called my cell at 6:12 p.m. and told me a 6-year-old was missing in the North Fork. Flathead County SAR was mobilizing out of Kalispell, and anyone with working knowledge of the Coal Creek and Whale Creek drainages was being requested to assist. I was in my truck and on the road in 15 minutes. The staging area was a gravel pullout on the North Fork Road, a mile south of the brewer cabin, where the road widened enough to hold multiple vehicles. 14 people when I arrived at 8:20. Rick Summers, the Flathead County SAR coordinator, and a deputy sheriff I'd worked with on a lost hiker situation in the Whale Creek Basin in 2017, and who had a reputation for running systematic and disciplined search operations. A dog team from Kalispell with a certified tracking handler and a Belgian Malinois who had been part of 3 successful finds in the North Fork drainage in the previous 4 field seasons, and 3 volunteers from the Glacier Nordic Club who knew this section of the North Fork as well as anyone outside the Forest Service payroll. Rick assigned sectors, and I took the northeast sector covering the Coal Creek approach because I could cover it faster than anyone else he had, and because the terrain would naturally carry a small person walking north in that direction. The dog team went out first with the tracking handler, starting from the porch where Owen had last been seen and working the scent out from there. The Malinois picked up the trail from the porch steps and carried it 200 yards north-northeast into the timber before losing it in a low depression where the terrain was channeling the wind and dispersing the scent cone. Beyond that point, the trail was gone. The handler worked the dog in expanding arcs around the depression for 30 minutes in the wind and falling snow and couldn't relocate it. The timber was too dense, the wind too irregular, the snow accumulating too fast. The dog team marked the depression's location on the GPS and reported back to Rick. We called Owen's name for 4 hours. The search teams worked their sectors with headlamps and radios, crossing the terrain systematically, calling at intervals, listening between calls. The forest at night in a November storm is a specific kind of difficult. The headlamps illuminate a cone of falling snow and the shadows of trees and not much else. The wind makes sounds in the canopy that your tired brain keeps interpreting as responses, and the ground is uneven in ways that don't show up until you step on them. I worked the Coal Creek approach from the staging area up toward the bench, covering about 1.5 miles of terrain in the sector and finding nothing. No tracks, no sign, no sound that wasn't wind. The temperature was dropping steadily through the evening, reaching -4 by 10 p.m., according to the reading on my truck thermometer. At midnight, Rick suspended the active search and ordered all teams back to the staging area. One of the Nordic volunteers had 2 fingers that had stopped registering temperature and needed warming before they became a medical problem. The dog team was done for the night. The temperature was -4 and the wind was gusting to 40 miles per hour. Rick made the correct call. The mathematics of cold weather search and rescue are not ambiguous, and adding searchers to the list of people requiring rescue doesn't help the person you're originally searching for. I drove to the Pole Bridge Ranger Station and laid my sleeping bag on the floor of the work center. The building was propane heated and smelled of old coffee and cold gear, and the specific damp mineral smell of equipment that has been used and dried and used again in this kind of country across many field seasons. The smell is particular to the North Fork somehow, something in the combination of the cedar and spruce of the drainage and the cold and the equipment that accumulates it, and I've always found it grounding rather than unpleasant. But I couldn't sleep. The wind was working at the corners of the building in a pattern my exhausted brain kept trying to find a rhythm in, and I lay there tracing the terrain north of the brewer cabin in my head, and I thought about Camera 12. The bench where Camera 12 was positioned was 1.4 miles from the North Fork Road, in the direction a child heading north-northeast from the cabin would eventually reach if he kept going through the lodgepole and the alder, and the creek crossings between the cabin and the coal. Creek drainage. The camera had been running since mid-October. It would have captured anything that moved across that bench. If Owen had made it to the bench before he went down, the camera had seen him. I could not get Camera 12 out of my head. I kept running the arithmetic. The distance from the cabin, the direction of the tracks, the bench at 1.4 miles. If Owen had made it to the bench before he went down, the camera had seen him. The second day's search deployed at 6:45 Thursday morning. Temperature -8, wind 12 miles per hour, intermittent flurries rather than the sustained wall of snow we'd had Wednesday night. Rick had gotten 5 fresh SAR volunteers from Kalispell overnight, and we deployed 22 people in overlapping sectors, working the terrain methodically outward from the cabin in all directions. I worked my sector through the morning and into the afternoon, calling Owen's name into a forest that had gone absolutely still under its 3 feet of new snow. The lodge poles were weighted into their bent shapes, and the light was flat and white and directionless, and every sound I made was absorbed into the snowpack and returned nothing. There is a specific quality to the North Fork timber in those conditions. Sound does not travel the way it does in warmer air. You hear your own voice for a moment, and then it is pulled down into the snowpack before it reaches the nearest tree line. I covered about 2.5 miles of terrain in my sector over the morning, crossing the Coal Creek drainage at 2 points and working the benches on either side, finding no tracks and no sign and nothing except the evidence of birds moving through the timber and the occasional coyote track cutting across an open slope and then disappearing into the spruce on the far side. Mark Kowalski was at the staging area most of Thursday, at the edge of the group with his arms crossed and his eyes on the timber. Thursday afternoon, he told me Owen had watched a Clark's nutcracker work a pine cone on the cabin fence post Wednesday morning for 15 minutes without moving, completely still, tracking the bird. He told me this the way people tell specific small things when the large thing is too present to approach directly. I thought privately that a child who could be still for 15 minutes watching a bird had patience, and patience in the cold was a form of heat. By noon Thursday, Owen had been missing 21 hours. The medics at the staging area were running the calculations they are trained to run in circumstances like these, and I could see it in how they communicated with each other, in the economy of words, in the specific pauses, in the calibration of what they said within Mark's hearing, and what they said to each other at a distance from him. A 60-pound 6-year-old in recreational winter clothing rated to -10 degrees. Wednesday night had reached -4 at the staging area, which was at lower elevation and more sheltered than the bench above Coal Creek. Thursday was forecast to bottom out at -15 overnight. The medics knew what those numbers produced, and they were being professional about knowing it, which meant they were not saying it out loud in front of the family. In the afternoon rotation, I found myself working the ridge above the Coal Creek approach, following a game trail that contoured around the slope and gave me sightlines into the timber below. The storm had left the forest in a state that was beautiful and hostile at once. The lodge poles draped in white, the creek channels marked by the line of alder that rose above the snow surface, the air absolutely clear and cold after the storm, the mountains visible to the east above Glacier Park in a sharpness they only have in extreme cold. It would have been worth photographing if I'd been anywhere else. Out here, it was just the country telling me what it was dealing in. Thursday evening, I was on rotation until 1 a.m. Friday, out in the timber, with a headlamp, calling a name into the dark, and hearing nothing back except the occasional branch settling its snow load somewhere in the canopy with a soft thump. Rick stood me down at 1 and told me he needed me functional for the Friday push. I went back to the Polebridge Work Center and laid down in my sleeping bag and did not sleep. I lay on the floor in the propane heat and thought about Camera 12. At some point around 3 in the morning, I made the decision to go out and pull the card before the morning deployment. The decision was based on the arithmetic I'd been running since 1 a.m. Wednesday. If Owen had made it to the bench, the camera had seen him, and knowing that could change where we deployed people on Friday morning. The card would still be there if I waited until after the deployment, but knowing its contents before might matter. At 4:30 Friday morning, I got up, dressed in everything I had, ate the granola bar I'd saved from my pack, drank the cold coffee from the thermos I'd made the previous evening, and went out into -12. I snowshoed to Camera 12 by headlamp. The Coal Creek drainage in November before first light after a serious storm is a specific environment that I know from many pre-dawn approaches over the field seasons. The lodge poles bent into their snow-loaded shapes, each branch describing a long, slow arc under its accumulated weight. The snowpack surface crusted hard from the cold and the wind and catching my headlamp in a flat blue-white flash that was hard on tired eyes in the dark. My snowshoes made a rhythmic compression sound on the crust, and my breath came out in visible plumes that the cold dissolved immediately. 40 minutes at that pace is enough time to think, which I did not want to be doing, so I focused on my footing and listened to the forest around me quietly instead. I covered the 1.4 miles to the bench in 40 minutes, moving steadily but not rushing, because rushing in that terrain in those conditions costs more energy than it saves. The camera was on its lodge pole, intact. A thin film of ice had formed across the lens housing from the storm, and I cleared it with my gloved finger, clear enough that the camera had likely been triggering through it. Though some images might have a slight fog at the edges, the indicator light was showing triggering activity. I pulled the SD card from the slot, seated the fresh card I'd brought in its place, and placed the pulled card in the chest pocket of my base layer, inside 2 more layers of insulation, against my body to keep it functional in the cold. The whole exchange took 3 minutes, then I snowshoed back out. I arrived at the staging area at 6:43, 2 minutes before the morning deployment briefing. 22 people again, fresh rotations in from Kalispell. Rick Summers went through the grid assignments, adjusted slightly from the previous day based on where we hadn't yet covered adequately. The SD card from camera 12 was in my chest pocket. I had not looked at it. I put on my pack and joined the team working the Coal Creek drainage from the south and went into the timber. Diane Schultz found Owen at 11:49. She was a Nordic Club volunteer who had been working the lower Coal Creek bench with her partner since around 9 in the morning, covering the terrain systematically with compass bearings and GPS waypoints. She came over the radio in the voice that SAR personnel developed from training and necessity, every word placed with absolute precision, the professional voice of someone who is managing something enormous by maintaining complete control, because the alternative to control in that moment is not available. She said she had a visual on the child. She said the child was on the ground. She gave her GPS coordinates. I looked at the coordinates on my own unit and saw they put her at the lower Coal Creek bench, about 100 yards from camera 12. She said the child was not responding to her voice. Then she said, "He's warm. He's breathing. Get the medics here now." Kalispell Regional Medical Center's air rescue team had Owen airborne by 12:47. His core temperature on arrival was 93 degrees Fahrenheit, moderate hypothermia, survivable with treatment. His heart remained regular throughout the rewarming process. The frostbite on 2 toes and 2 fingers resolved without permanent damage. His attending physician told Mark and Julie Kowalski their son would be fine. I was still at the staging area when the word came through on the radio. I stood by my truck and let the relief move through me. And it took about 30 seconds. And then I thought about the SD card in my chest pocket that I had not yet looked at. I drove home to Hungry Horse. I picked Liz up from the Kalispell airport at 7 in the evening. She could see from my face what 4 days of abbreviated sleep and sustained cold had done, and she didn't press me for details on the drive home. I told her about the search, the parts I could tell while I was still processing the other parts. She heated up the soup she'd brought back from Portland, the Italian lentil soup from the market near her sister's apartment, and I ate 2 bowls, and it was the best thing I'd had since Tuesday. She went to bed at 9 because she'd been traveling all day. I sat down at my desk in the spare room, turned on my laptop, and put the SD card in the reader. The Reconyx software loaded the images oldest to newest. I scrolled through the first 30 frames the way I always review wildlife cards, quickly, Wolverine silhouette first, logging everything else as I went. November 17th through midday November 20th. A bull elk at dawn, a coyote on the 18th, a white-tailed doe with a late calf on the 19th. Standard material, the ordinary traffic of the bench across 3 days. Frame 43, November 20th, 3:47 in the afternoon. The Reconyx Hyperfire 2 shoots color images in daylight, the color determined by the camera's ambient light sensor, and shifts to black and white infrared when the light drops below a threshold. The 3:47 frame was still in color, the light flat and gray and diminishing rapidly under the storm that had been building to the northwest since 2 o'clock. The color was the specific flat gray of a November afternoon in the North Fork, under cloud cover. Not the rich blue-gray of an overcast summer day, but the bleached, attenuated gray of inadequate winter light trying to penetrate low cloud. Against that gray, against the gray of the snow on the bench and the gray-brown of the lodge poles, the red of Owen Kowalski's down jacket was very, very red. He was in the lower left quadrant of the frame, 30 feet from the camera, moving northeast along the bench. His hood was up and his hands were in his pockets, and his stride was the lurching, unfocused stride of a small person who is cold and disoriented and has lost whatever direction he started with, not the purposeful walking of a child heading somewhere, but the going-on moving of a child who is too cold to stop but doesn't know where to go. The camera captured him across 4 triggered images as he moved northeast along the bench, and then out of the right-hand edge of the frame. Based on the timestamps, He was in the camera's field of view for about 7 minutes. He was heading northeast along the bench, toward the upper Coal Creek drainage and the denser timber beyond. I stopped the lightbox scroll at the 4 images of Owen and looked at each one carefully. He had been missing for about 4¼ hours when he crossed in front of camera 12. His posture in the images was the posture of a child whose body temperature is dropping, the hunched shoulders, the hands deep in the pockets, the slightly forward head tilt of someone who is colder than they should be. But he was upright and moving with coordination. Whatever he had experienced in the hours since he left the cabin porch, he was still functional when the camera caught him. Frame 48, 4:12 in the afternoon, 18 minutes after Owen's last frame. I clicked to open it and went very still. What was in the frame was walking on 2 legs. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say that, because the distinction matters, and I have thought carefully about how to describe it. When I say something was walking on 2 legs, I don't mean the incidental bipedal posture of a black bear that stands briefly to investigate something or to improve its sightline. I don't mean the momentary upright position of a deer startled from a lying down position. I mean the sustained, stride-consistent, arm-opposing, weight-forward locomotion of an animal that travels on 2 legs as its primary mode of moving through terrain. The 4:12 frame, along with the 2 immediately following triggered frames, showed that. Sustained bipedal locomotion at a walking pace, consistent across all 3 frames, moving northeast along the bench in the direction Owen had gone 18 minutes earlier. The stride length derived from the motion blur across consecutive frames was about 4.5 feet. The figure's height, which I determined by comparison against the cut bank visible at the right edge of the frame, I know that cut bank is 9 feet because I've stood next to it and measured it, was consistent with that cut bank at its full extension. I will not give a specific foot measurement because I know how unreliable camera-based height estimates can be, and I'm not going to introduce that kind of error into what I'm describing. What I can say without qualification is that the top of the figure's head was level with the top of a 9-foot cut bank. The proportions were wrong for anything I know from this drainage, from this state, from any state. The arms were long relative to the torso, measurably longer than human proportions would account for. The hands were visible at mid-thigh level when the arms were hanging relaxed. The shoulders were very broad, the head sitting directly on them without the visible neck separation that a person shows even at distance in a camera frame. The hair was near black in the color frame, dense across the back and shoulders, moving slightly in the wind. The figure was moving northeast at a walking pace, following the line Owen had taken along the bench, and then it was gone, out of the right edge of the frame. The 4:15, 4:20, and 4:25 time-lapse frames showed the empty bench, falling snow, and the lodgepoles beginning to bend in the building wind. I had my hand on the mouse, but I wasn't moving it. My coffee, which I'd made before sitting down, had gone cold. Outside the window, it was full dark, and the temperature was dropping, and the stars were bright where the clouds had cleared after the storm. And inside the house, everything was very quiet because Liz was asleep and I was alone at my desk with what was on the screen in front of me. At 4:58, the camera triggered again. The 4:58 frame was still in color, the absolute last of the November daylight, the sky already dark at the edges, and would be fully dark in another 15 minutes. Owen was back in the lower left of the frame, in roughly the area where the camera had first caught him at 3:47, but now he was on the ground. He was on his side with his knees drawn up and his arms crossed over his chest, the cold conservation posture, the position the body automatically assumes when it is running short of heat and trying to protect what remains by minimizing its surface area exposed to the cold air. His eyes were closed. The red jacket was very bright against the white snow. The posture was specific enough that I can describe it in physical terms, even without being able to explain what produced it. Left side of the body facing northwest, into the storm, directly into the direction the wind was coming from. Right side angled toward the cut bank behind Owen, which formed a natural barrier on the east. The figure's mass was positioned to fill the gap between the incoming wind direction and the child on the ground, and the positioning was not incidental. The weight was carried low and forward, the body angled to present the maximum surface area to the northwest wind. Snow that had been falling since 3 o'clock had collected on the figure's windward surface, building a white layer across the back and left shoulder, while the leeward surface, the side facing Owen, remained dark and clear. Snow was landing on the figure's body and not reaching Owen. The figure's body was doing the work of a windbreak. If you had been sitting at my desk in Hungry Horse that night with those 63 frames on the screen in front of you, I want to know what you would have done. Would you have reported it? Turned over the SD card? Started the institutional chain that couldn't be stopped once it started? Or done what I did? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely mean that as a question. The subsequent frames ran through Wednesday night and all of Thursday. Time-lapse images every 4 hours, plus additional motion triggers when falling snow or wind-moved branches triggered the sensor, and in every one of those frames the figure remained in position on the Coal Creek bench with Owen in its lee. 9 p.m. Wednesday. The figure unchanged, the snow on its windward surface now inches thick across the back and left shoulder, that surface gradually whiting over as the storm deposited new snow on what had already accumulated. The leeward side stayed dark and clear, sheltered from the snowfall by the figure's own mass. Owen visible in the lower left, the red jacket partially drifted over with wind-deposited snow, but the infrared, which had taken over from the color sensor as the daylight failed, showed Owen as a lighter shape than the surrounding snow. Warmer than his environment, body heat still present and being retained. 1 a.m. Thursday, the temperature had reached -4, and the wind was sustained at 30 miles per hour. The snow collected on the figure's windward surface had compacted into a 2-foot drift against its left side, the storm building a secondary barrier against the primary one the figure had made with itself. It had not moved to clear the drift. It had accepted it. 5 a.m. Thursday. The storm was at its worst in this frame. The lodgepole branches, visible at the edges of the camera's field of view, were moving hard in sustained gusts that I estimated at 30 to 40 miles per hour, based on the degree of branch deflection I could see. Owen on the ground, unchanged. The figure in position. The drift on its windward side now 3 feet deep. The whole structure. Figure plus drift, plus cut bank behind Owen, functioning as a compound wind barrier that had grown more effective as the storm added to it. In the infrared, the space between Owen's body and the figure's body, the protected pocket on the leeward side, registered as a distinctly lighter band of gray against the dark of the surrounding snow. The Reckonix infrared sensor resolves thermal differences to within a degree or two under good conditions, and what the 5 a.m. frame showed was a zone of retained heat in that pocket, measurably warmer than the surrounding snow surface, bounded on the windward side by the figure's body and on the east by the cut bank. The figure's resting metabolic heat output was accumulating in that enclosed space, rather than dispersing into the storm wind. The physics of what was happening were the same physics that make any shelter warm: a solid mass on the cold side, an enclosed space, and a heat source within it. The heat source here was the figure's body, and the pocket it was maintaining was warm enough to matter. Owen's core temperature on arrival at Kalispell Regional was 93 degrees Fahrenheit after 31 hours in a blizzard, at temperatures down to -15, in recreational winter clothing, with no insulated ground pad and no supplemental heat source. That outcome is not expected. The only explanation is the thermal management visible in the infrared record, the figure holding position, the pocket of retained warmth between its body and the cut bank, hour after hour through the worst of the storm. 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. Thursday, the figure unchanged, the compound barrier of body plus drift plus cut bank fully established. By then, I was 2 miles south and west, calling a child's name into timber that gave me nothing back, while a camera I had bolted to a lodgepole pine 7 weeks earlier was recording a picture every 4 hours of what was keeping that child alive. 5 p.m. Thursday, Owen slightly repositioned. Still on the ground, still on the bench, but his head had turned perhaps a quarter turn from facing away from the figure to angling toward it. A small shift, but visible in the frame at the resolution the Reconnix provided. I noted it in the log I was keeping alongside the image review. 1 a.m. Friday. The change had completed. Owen was on his back. His face was fully visible in the infrared frame, tilted upward, and his eyes were open. He was looking at the figure. I've spent 5 years thinking about what to say about that frame. I cannot read a child's expression in black and white infrared at 30 feet with any confidence the resolution supports. What I can document with certainty is the body's state. Not in cold conservation posture, not attempting to move away from or escape the figure beside him, but open and relaxed and oriented toward it, with the specific quality of stillness that is not the stillness of cold incapacitation, but the stillness of a person who is present and awake and has reached a conclusion about where they are. Owen had been on that bench for 16 hours when the 1 a.m. Friday frame caught him looking at the figure. He was 6 years old, and in the arithmetic of cold and warmth and darkness and presence that a 6-year-old runs, he had arrived at an answer. 9 a.m. Friday. Owen on his back, eyes closed. I looked at his face in the frame carefully. The relaxed jaw and the softening around the eyes were the signs of genuine sleep rather than cold incapacitation. The face of a person who is genuinely resting rather than slackening. The figure unchanged in its position. The last frame containing the figure was time-stamped 11:51 a.m. on Friday, November 22nd. Diane Schultz found Owen at 11:52. 1 minute. I've been reading that gap for 5 years, and what I arrive at each time is this. The figure knew the search team was coming before the search team arrived. Diane's team had been working the Coal Creek drainage from the south since around 9 that morning. By 11 a.m., they were within audible range of the bench, 22 people on snowshoes, carrying radios, calling a name, audible through cold, clear air at 300 yards or more to anything with functional hearing in this drainage. Something that had tracked a disoriented child through a blizzard in failing light and held position on an exposed bench for 31 hours through -15 temperatures would not have failed to detect an approaching. The group of 22 at that distance, in those conditions. There are 4 trigger frames at 11:51 a.m., spanning about 4 seconds. In the first, the figure stands at full height oriented north, no longer crouching. In the second, the head is turned back toward Owen. In the third, the figure is looking north again. In the fourth, the figure is gone, moved out of the frame to the north, and in the space where it had been, Owen is sitting upright in the snow under his own power, his body weight supported by his own musculature, in the position he would be in 8 minutes later when Diane Schultz came over the bench and found him. 4 seconds. The head turning back toward what it was leaving, a pause of no more than a breath, then turning north and going. I have been trying to understand for 5 years what kind of thing pauses for 4 seconds to look back at the end of 31 hours of staying. I made my decision before I finished scrolling through the last frames, though I didn't articulate it in those terms until the following day when I told Liz. I copied the 63 images to an external drive I keep at home for research data that isn't ready for the official database. I removed the SD card from the reader and placed it in a padded envelope, which I sealed, and put it in the fire safe we keep under the stairs, the one that holds the deed to the house, the insurance documents, and Liz's grandmother's ring. My official field record for Camera 12, Station 12, covering the period from November 17th through December 1st, noted that the camera had captured 2 cow elk and a white-tailed doe during the survey period. That is factually accurate based on the images from the replacement card I installed on Friday morning when I was at the bench before the deployment. The images from the original card do not appear in any database that the Flathead National Forest or Montana FWP maintains. If someone searched the Wolverine monitoring records for unusual activity in the Coal Creek drainage in November of 2019, they would find nothing. I told Liz the following evening, after she had slept and I had slept and we both had the cognitive capacity for a conversation that was going to require sustained attention. She listened across the kitchen table with her tea getting cold beside her, her face doing the specific thing it does when she is processing information that doesn't fit any existing framework, not skepticism, not disbelief, but a kind of methodical recalibration, the face of someone building a new category in real time. When I finished, she put both hands around the mug and looked at the table for a moment. Then she asked whether it had known Owen would be found. I have been working on that question for 5 years. The departure at 11:51, 1 minute before Diane Schultz called in her visual, is the most specific evidence I have. Both possible answers require the same capabilities. An entity that had monitored the approach of 22 people through cold, clear air from several hundred yards, that chose its moment of departure with precision, and that left Owen sitting upright, rather than in the prone, cold conservation position he'd maintained for most of 31 hours. Whether the distinction between those two motivations is meaningful is something I've stopped pressing, because the outcome was the same either way. I drove to Missoula 3 weeks after the search, on a Sunday morning in mid-December. Mark Kowalski had agreed to let me come when I called and explained who I was, the person who maintained the camera in the Coal Creek drainage where Owen was found, and that I had questions about what Owen had experienced out there. Mark said he would ask Owen whether he was willing to talk, and Owen had said yes. I drove to Missoula on a cold, clear Sunday, the mountains visible from both sides of Highway 93, the valley floor dusted white with overnight snow. I spent most of the drive thinking about what I was going to say. I still hadn't worked it out by the time I pulled up in front of the Kowalski house. It was a brick ranch on the south side of Missoula, backing up to a belt of cottonwood trees along an irrigation ditch, a basketball hoop in the driveway, a pair of small boots on the porch, the evidence of a house where a child lived in specific and accumulated ways. Julie Kowalski met me at the door and poured me a cup of coffee and told me in the kitchen, while Owen finished his lunch at the table in the next room, that every time they tried to get Owen to tell the complete story of what had happened during those 31 hours, he would get a particular expression, not frightened or reluctant, but resolute, as if he had made a decision, and say he wasn't supposed to talk about it. Those words exactly? I asked. Every time. Like there was a rule someone had given him. We asked him who told him he wasn't supposed to, and he said nobody told him. It just felt like that. I sat across from Owen after lunch. He was small for his age, dark-haired like his father, with the same wide-set eyes and the kind of directness that some children have. The quality of paying attention without filtering what they're paying attention through. He was 3 weeks past the drainage, and he had been through a medical ordeal, and he looked like a child who had processed it rather than been sheltered from it, which is a different look entirely. He had a cup of hot chocolate between his palms, and he was turning it slowly, absorbing the warmth through his hands. I told him I worked in the mountains where he'd gotten lost. I told him I had cameras in the forest out there, cameras that took pictures of the animals, and that my cameras had taken pictures while he was outside in the storm. I asked if he'd like to hear about that. He looked at me sideways for a moment, the way kids look at things they're deciding how to approach. Then he looked at me directly. "You saw it," he said. "Yes." He nodded and turned the cup in his hands. He looked at the hot chocolate for a moment, then looked up. "It found me when I fell," he said. "I was by the creek, and I fell, and my legs stopped working right, and I couldn't get up. And it came. It didn't make any noise when it came. It was just there. And it was really warm." He thought about it. "Like a dog that's been sleeping in the sun, but a lot more warm." I asked him what he remembered about the night. "I was cold," he said, "but not as cold when it was there. It made a sound." He set the cup down on the table and hummed. Low, sustained, a note that started in the chest rather than the throat, that he held for about 4 seconds before it faded out. It was a specific frequency, low enough to be felt before it was heard, the kind of low note that resonates in the sternum rather than arriving at the ears through the air in the usual way. I had been standing on the Coal Creek bench at 2 p.m. on Friday, the day of the airlift, alone in the area where Owen had been found. I'd been standing still holding an empty evidence bag, and I had felt a vibration in my sternum that lasted about 4 seconds and then stopped. I had attributed it to a truck on the North Fork Road 2 miles south. Standing in the Kowalski kitchen, listening to Owen hum that frequency, I knew with complete certainty what it had actually been. When the hum stopped, there was a pause. The kitchen was quiet. Julie was at the counter with her back to us. "Like that," Owen said. "Yes," I said. "Like that." He picked up the cup again. He said he had slept. He said he had woken up once in the dark and knew it was still there because of the warmth and the sound. He said when the light came back in the morning, he could see it better. It was big. It had hair like a big dog, but longer. It had a face. Like a person face, he said, but bigger. And the eyes were old. "Old how?" I asked. He thought about this, the way children think carefully when they are trying to be precise in words that don't quite fit what they're trying to say. Like how Grandpa's eyes look when he's tired but still paying attention, kind, but old. Before I left, I asked Owen how he knew he wasn't supposed to talk about it. He looked at me again with his father's direct eyes. "It just felt like that," he said. "Like when you know you shouldn't tell something." I drove home to Hungry Horse in the late afternoon, the mountains going dark against the last light to the west, and I thought about old eyes and what Owen meant by them, and about the frequency he had hummed at a kitchen table in Missoula. I thought about what 31 hours of cold and warmth and sound and presence had settled into, in a 6-year-old's understanding, to produce that specific answer about not supposed to. I had gone back to the Coal Creek bench on the Friday afternoon of the airlift, before driving to Kalispell for the airport. Pulling the camera from its tree was my stated reason for being there, and I served that reason. But I spent 2 hours on the bench before I left, and what I found is in the field notebook that lives in my desk drawer alongside the USB drive. The snow at the base of the cut bank was compressed in an area roughly 6 feet by 8 feet. Not the sharp-edged depressions of footprints in soft snow, but a broad, even flattening of the kind that sustained weight over many hours produces. The snow crystals in the upper layer fused slightly from repeated heat exposure and refreezing, the surface texture different from the surrounding undisturbed snow, tactile as well as visual. You could feel the difference through a glove on the crusted surface. The center of the compressed area was measurably warmer than the snow around it at 2 in the afternoon on Friday, 6 hours after the figure had left the bench. The mass that had occupied that space had generated enough metabolic heat over 31 hours that the ground beneath had retained some of it. I measured the temperature at several points using a probe thermometer from my pack, and the readings in the compressed area were consistently 2 to 3 degrees warmer than the surrounding snowpack at the same depth. At 3 locations around the perimeter of the compressed area, I found depressions that I believe were contact points where the figure had repositioned at some point during the 31 hours, hands or feet, most likely hands based on the shape. These were not conventional footprint impressions in soft snow, but compressions in frozen crust, showing a broad 5-pointed contact pattern, each contact point roughly 15 inches across in its longest dimension. I measured my own hand against one of them. I wear a size large glove, and the contact point was about 3 times the area of my open palm. I found hair. On the exposed root face of the cut bank, where the bank's clay and root fibers would have been in contact with the figure's back for 31 hours, there were strands caught in the roots. 12 strands total, collected one by one with the tweezers I keep in my field kit for hair sample collection from wolverine rub posts. Each strand placed separately in a paper envelope from my pack, the envelope labeled with the location, the date, and the GPS coordinates, and placed in my chest pocket for the hike out. I've examined those strands under a 10-power loop in my home office, near black at the base, lightening toward the tip in a consistent gradation across all 12 strands. The structure doesn't match any North American mammal species I've worked with in 20 years in the Flathead. Coarser than deer guard hair, finer than bison, with a slight crimp about 2/3 down the shaft not described in any reference I've been able to consult. Consistent diameter across all 12 strands, suggesting a single body region with uniform follicle structure. I have not submitted the hair for professional laboratory analysis. My reasoning for this is the same reasoning that led me to put the SD card in the fire safe rather than in the official data system. Once physical evidence enters an institutional system and generates data, that data has obligations and momentum that I can't control and that don't serve the interest I'm trying to protect. I've watched enough wildlife data instrumentalized in ways that had nothing to do with the animal it described to know that I am not willing to put these 12 strands of hair into a laboratory pipeline without being certain where that pipeline leads. I own that decision. There are days I'm less certain about it than others. Most days I think about Owen Kowalski sitting upright in the snow at 11:52 on a November morning, supported by his own musculature, warm enough to survive, alive and present when the search team came over the bench. The fire safe under the stairs holds the SD card in its padded envelope, the 12 hair strands in their labeled envelope, and a USB drive with the 63 images copied to a folder labeled Survey Data, November 2019. If something happens to me and Liz has to go through the safe, she'll know what it is. She's known since the evening after Owen was airlifted, and she has agreed with my decision every time we've discussed it, including once a year in November when she checks in. I've returned to the Coal Creek bench every July since 2019. Not on the Wolverine survey schedule, which continues under my replacement at the district office, but on my own time, driving out in the early morning when the North Fork Road is still passable, and hiking into the bench by mid-morning when the July light is full and the wildflowers are in the clearings and the western larch canopy is fully leafed. Out, filtering the sunlight in that specific warm way of high summer in the North Fork. I bring a thermos of coffee and a notebook, and I sit on a fallen log above the bench with a view of the cut bank and the pond beyond it, and I wait. On 3 of the 5 July visits, the forest has gone quiet in a way I've come to recognize. The birds dropping their background conversation, the insects pausing, a quality of attention in the air that is present rather than absent, the way the air in a room changes when someone enters it. Then the musk has come, warm and dense and specific, not like anything else in the drainage. I sit still and watch the tree line, and after some interval, sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes 20, the musk fades and the forest resumes. It's ordinary life, and I am alone on the bench in the summer air. In July of 2021, I found a structure in the Whale Creek Basin about 3 miles north of the Coal Creek Bench. 7 lodgepole pines bent and interwoven at 10 feet off the ground, their tops locked together to form a partial canopy over a compacted area roughly 15 feet by 20 feet. The bends were smooth arcs with intact wood fibers, the controlled lateral deformation of wood bent under sustained pressure in a specific direction, not the sudden break of wind, throw, or the gradual lean of snow loading. I have a workbench in my garage, and I've spent time since then testing what it takes to produce a controlled, smooth arc in a lodgepole at 4 to 5 inches diameter, the size of the bent trees in the structure, and I can tell you that it requires more sustained lateral force than I can comfortably generate. I photographed the structure from multiple angles and documented the location in my notebook. In July of 2022, I returned to the same location in the Whale Creek Basin. The 7 lodge poles were standing straight again. The bent and woven canopy was gone. The compacted area below it was weathering back toward the surrounding forest floor. The 2021 photographs are on the USB drive in the fire safe. The game avoidance pattern around the Coal Creek Bench has stabilized into something I can document in the aerial transect counts I run as part of the ongoing Wolverine program. Elk and deer traffic in a roughly 40-acre radius centered on the bench shows consistent reduction year over year compared to equivalent habitat on either side of that zone. The reduction is not the angular, alarm behavior avoidance you see around a wolf pack's core territory. The animals don't show stress postures at the perimeter or circle it repeatedly. They redirect smoothly, the way water moves around, a submerged obstruction that doesn't threaten them but occupies the space. A wide, unhurried arc around something that is simply there and that they understand, in the way animals understand things, is not to be interfered with. Owen is 12 now. The Kowalski family sends a Christmas card each December, a family photo. He is taller than Julie in the most recent one, still dark-haired, with his father's wide-set eyes, and in this year's photo he has a lopsided grin that is entirely his own, not his father's expression, not his mother's. Something he's arrived at himself in the past 6 years. Mark told me when I called to check in on the family in the 3rd year after the search that Owen talks about the Coal Creek drainage exactly as much as he wants to and not more, and that what he says when he does talk about it is always the same. That it was warm, that it made a good sound, that it stayed until the people came. Mark does not know what Camera 12 documented. I have not shown the images to anyone except Liz. I've thought about what the images would mean to Owen when he's old enough to engage with all of them fully. The technical details of the infrared, the thermal physics, the hair strands and their structure, the gap between 1151 and 1152, and each time I arrive at the same conclusion, he already has what he needs. He was 6 years old and cold and alone in the dark, and something found him and stayed. Whether the image that explains how explains anything he doesn't already carry from having been there is not clear to me, and I'm not going to press that question until he does. I'm 52 years old. I retired from the Hungry Horse District in 2023 after 19 years. The Wolverine program continues under my successor. The camera array is still running. Camera 12 is still on its lodgepole at the mouth of Coal Creek. The record in the fire safe is something I think about now, that I am no longer the person maintaining the camera array and the field program that provides my legitimate reason for being in that drainage. I do not have a good answer for what happens to it when I'm gone. It doesn't belong to me, though I collected it and have kept it for 5 years. It doesn't belong to any institution I can identify that would receive it appropriately, that would understand what it represents and what the obligations that come with it actually are. It may belong to Owen eventually. He'll be an adult in 6 years. I'm not in any rush to have that conversation, and I'll let it find its moment rather than force it. What I know, without qualification, after 5 years of sitting with 63 infrared images and 12 strands of near-black hair and a field notebook, and the memory of an afternoon on a frozen bench in the Coal Creek drainage and a 6-year-old Dollars humming a chest-originating note at a kitchen table in Missoula, in the Coal Creek drainage of the Flathead National Forest, on a bench where a camera still runs and the cut bank still shows the clay face that was measurably warm to the touch on a Friday afternoon in November. A 6-year-old boy named Owen Kowalski spent 31 hours in a Montana blizzard at temperatures that should have been the last things he ever felt. He is 12 years old now, taller than his mother, with a lopsided grin that is entirely his own, and says when he talks about it that it was warm and it made a good sound, and it stayed until the people came. For anyone who has spent real time in the deep mountain forests of the northern Rockies, the kind of country where the roads end and the timber goes on for another 30 miles, and the cell service died an hour ago, and the only evidence of human presence is the trail you're making, and whoever came before you, you understand something about what I'm describing that other people have to take on faith? You've felt the specific quality that some sections of that country have when you're in them alone, the quality of being in a place that has its own attention, its own awareness of what moves through it. Most of the time that quality is background. It's the forest doing what the forest does, and you're part of it, and nothing remarkable happens. But occasionally, in the sections that are truly remote and truly intact, you're in it, and it's in you, and the distinction blurs just enough to remind you that you're not the only one keeping track. The SD card is in the fire safe. The hair strands are in the envelope. The notebook has 5 more years of entries since Owen was airlifted from the North Fork. The bench is still there. Whatever kept Owen warm on that bench is still out there, doing what it has always done. That is what I know.